There are doors in your life that you believe are permanently closed, sealed not with locks and keys, but with the quiet weight of assumption. They are the doors to rooms you never dare to imagine entering, rooms where the air is different, where the light falls in a way you've only dreamed of. You learn to live in the hallway, content with the friendship that exists in that shared, familiar space. You learn to ignore the faint line of light beneath the door, the whisper of a possibility you tell yourself is just a draft. And then one day, someone you love, someone who has lived in that hallway with you for years, simply reaches out, turns the knob without a word, and holds the door open, waiting to see if you are brave enough to walk through. That night, for me, was the turning of the knob. Alex was the one holding the door, and I was the one standing on the threshold, terrified that the entire house would collapse if I took a single step forward. He was asleep, or at least pretending to be, his head resting in the crook of my shoulder, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm against my collarbone. The television murmured in the corner, casting flickering blue and silver light across the living room, turning the familiar landscape of my apartment into something foreign and cinematic. His arm was draped across my stomach, a casual, possessive weight that felt both impossibly heavy and utterly weightless. I could feel the warmth of him seeping through my t-shirt, a deep, cellular heat that seemed to be rearranging my own atoms, tuning them to his frequency. My entire body was a study in stillness, a photograph held in the developing tray for too long, the image burning itself permanently into the paper. I was afraid to breathe, afraid that the slightest movement would shatter the fragile architecture of the moment, a moment built on a single, spoken sentence an hour earlier. "Don't want to be alone tonight." That was all he had said, his voice rough with exhaustion as he stood in my doorway, his shoulders slumped, the city lights of his own life having finally dimmed. And then he had come straight to me. We had lived in the comfortable, well-worn hallway of our friendship for 7 years. I met Alex during my final year of university, a chance collision of orbits that felt, in retrospect, like an inevitability. I was a photography student, a creature of quiet observation, more comfortable behind a lens than in the middle of a conversation. My world was one of light and shadow, of capturing fleeting expressions and the silent stories told by the way a person held their hands. He was, in every way, my opposite. Alex was a business major and a competitive swimmer, a being of pure kinetic energy. He moved through the world with an unthinking confidence that I found both intimidating and captivating. He was loud where I was quiet, bright where I was muted, a supernova to my distant star. Our friendship shouldn't have worked. It was an anomaly, a glitch in the social matrix of campus life. Our meeting was as mundane as it was transformative. I was tasked with shooting the swim team for a portfolio project, a study in motion and form. I spent a week in the humid, chlorinated air of the natatorium, my lens focused on the explosive power of bodies cutting through water. I was invisible, a ghost in the machine, until Alex noticed me. After a practice, he had hauled himself out of the pool, water streaming from his hair and broad shoulders, and walked directly over to my corner. He didn't seem to care that he was dripping all over my equipment. He just smiled, a brilliant, disarming flash of white, and asked to see the pictures. He was fascinated not by the images of himself, but by a shot I had taken of an older swimmer, a senior named Mark, his face a mask of exhaustion and triumph as he touched the wall. Alex had pointed at the photo on my camera's small screen, a drop of water falling from his nose onto the display. "You saw that," he'd said, his voice filled with a genuine, almost childlike wonder. "Nobody else sees that. They just see the times on the board." In that moment, he saw me. He looked past the camera, past the quiet, awkward art student, and saw the way I saw the world. From that day forward, he became a fixture in my life. He would find me in the library, a whirlwind of energy disrupting the sacred silence, and drag me out for coffee. He would show up at my darkroom, peering with fascination at the ghost images appearing in the chemical baths, asking endless questions about f-stops and shutter speeds. He didn't just tolerate my quiet nature. He seemed to value it. He called it my superpower. He said I was the calm in his storm, the anchor that kept his ship from drifting out to sea. For him, I was a place of rest. For me, he was the entire, tumultuous, beautiful ocean. I had fallen in love with him gradually, and then all at once, the way a photograph develops in the dark. First, the faint outlines, the suggestion of a form, and then, suddenly, a fully realized image, undeniable and permanent. It was a quiet, hopeless kind of love, one I packed away into a small, locked box in my chest, a secret I intended to keep for the rest of my life. To risk our friendship, the most stable and important relationship I had ever known, for the flimsy possibility of something more felt like a form of madness. So I learned to live with the quiet ache, the constant, low-grade hum of my unspoken feelings. We graduated and moved into the same city, our lives running on parallel tracks that intersected frequently. He went into the high-stakes world of management consulting, a job that suited his energy and ambition but often left him frayed at the edges. I carved out a niche as a freelance photographer, specializing in portraiture and architectural work. My life was slower, more deliberate. Our apartments were 10 blocks apart, a comfortable distance that allowed for both independence and easy proximity. We were each other's constants in a city of variables. He was the first person I called when a client loved my work, and I was the first person he called when a project went sideways. We navigated relationships with other people, a series of girlfriends for him, a few cautious, short-lived connections for me. I would listen to him talk about the women he dated, offering quiet advice, my heart a dull, rhythmic pain in my chest. He was always a perfect gentleman, kind and considerate, but none of them ever seemed to last. There was always something missing, some fundamental frequency they couldn't tune into. I felt a terrible, guilty hope each time a relationship ended, a feeling I immediately buried under a fresh layer of self-loathing. He deserved to be happy. I just selfishly, secretly, wished that happiness could be with me. I remember one of his girlfriends, a lovely woman named Chloe, an architect who was smart and funny and seemed, on the surface, perfect for him. She had once said to me, over a dinner where Alex had been called away by work, that I understood a part of him that she never could. She said it without jealousy, with a kind of weary resignation. He recharges with you, Leo, she'd said, swirling the wine in her glass. He comes back from your apartment, and he's settled, like a compass needle that's finally found north. I don't know how you do it. I didn't know how to respond to that, because the answer was simple and impossible. I loved him, and all I did was create a space where he could just be. A space with no expectations, no demands, no need for performance. It was a space I had built out of the architecture of my own unrequited love, and it was the only thing I knew how to give him. They broke up a few months later. Alex had been sad, but also, I thought, relieved. Like a man who had been trying to wear a suit that was just a little too tight in the shoulders. The shift began subtly, a change in barometric pressure before a storm. It started about 3 months after his breakup with Chloe. He was leading a massive, company-wide project, a beast of a thing that was consuming his days and haunting his nights. The usual bright energy that radiated from him began to dim, the light in his eyes becoming strained. He started calling me late at night, his voice thin with exhaustion, just to talk about nothing in particular. He wasn't looking for solutions. He was just looking for a signal in the static, a voice that wasn't demanding something from him. He was a swimmer caught in a riptide, and I was the distant, steady lighthouse on the shore. I didn't try to rescue him. I just kept my light on, a silent promise that he was not alone in the dark water. The real catalyst arrived on a Tuesday in October. The kind of day where the sky is a flat, unforgiving gray, and the rain falls with a dreary persistence. He was supposed to have a final presentation, the culmination of months of work. He called me at noon, his voice hollow. The presentation had been a disaster. A key dataset had been corrupted, a senior partner had torn his team's conclusions apart, and the client was threatening to pull the contract. He sounded smaller than I had ever heard him, the usual resonance of his voice gone, replaced by a brittle quiet. He had described the feeling as standing in a glass room while everyone outside threw stones. He felt exposed and foolish and utterly exhausted. He said he was going home to sleep for 1,000 years. I told him to call me if he needed anything, the standard, useless phrase we offer in the face of someone else's pain. I expected him to retreat into his own space, to lick his wounds in private as he usually did. An hour later, my buzzer rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and saw him standing in the hallway, his shoulders hunched against a weight I couldn't see. He was soaked from the rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, his expensive suit looking like a ruined costume. I buzzed him in without a word. When he arrived at my door, he didn't even seem to have the energy to knock. He just stood there, waiting. I opened the door, and the sight of him was a physical blow. The confident, brilliant man I knew was gone, replaced by this ghost, his face pale and drawn. He looked past me, into the warm, quiet space of my apartment, as if it were a sanctuary. His eyes were wide with a kind of desperate exhaustion. "Hey," I said softly. "Hey," he whispered back, his voice barely audible. He took a half-step forward, into the threshold. "My place, it's too quiet. And too loud." All at the same time, he looked down at his hands, then back up at me. His gaze was direct, pleading. "I don't want to be alone tonight, Leo." And then he added the words that changed everything. "Can I just be here? With you?" It was a question that held a universe of unspoken need. It wasn't about a place to stay. It was about a person to be with. He had his own perfectly good, much larger, much more expensive apartment 10 blocks away. But he hadn't gone there. He had come here. To me. It was in that moment that the ritual began, born not of convenience, but of a deep, unarticulated need. My quiet, ordered world was about to be beautifully, terrifyingly disrupted. I stepped back, holding the door wider, a silent invitation. He walked in, bringing the scent of rain and defeat with him, and the delicate, unspoken rules that had governed our friendship for 7 years began to dissolve like sugar in water. That first night set the template. He shed his wet suit jacket, leaving it in a heap on a chair, a discarded skin. He didn't want to talk about work. He didn't want to talk at all. He just wanted to exist in a space that held no judgment. I made him tea, and we sat on my old, comfortable couch, a respectable distance between us. We put on a mindless action movie, something with lots of explosions and very little plot. The sound filled the silence, a buffer against the noise inside his own head. I watched him out of the corner of my eye. He was staring at the screen, but his focus was 1,000 miles away. Gradually, as the movie progressed, I saw the tension begin to leak out of him. His shoulders, which had been up around his ears, slowly descended. His jaw, which had been clenched tight, softened. About halfway through the film, he shifted, turning toward me slightly. "Is it okay if I just lean?" he asked, his voice hesitant, as if he were asking for something monumental. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was such a small thing, a simple request for a minor physical comfort, but it felt like a tectonic shift. I just nodded, unable to trust my voice. He slowly, carefully, leaned his head against my shoulder. The contact was electric. I could feel the dampness of his hair through my shirt, the solid weight of his skull against my collarbone. It was the most intimate we had ever been, and it was happening under the guise of simple, platonic comfort. My entire being was screaming. This was dangerous territory. This was the place where my carefully constructed walls could turn to dust. But I couldn't have pulled away if the room had been on fire. I just sat there, rigid and breathing, while he finally, seemed to find a moment of peace. He fell asleep like that, his breathing evening out, the last of his tension melting away into the safety he had found, for some reason, with me. I didn't move for over an hour, until my arm went numb and the movie credits were rolling. I just sat in the dark, with the weight of him against me, feeling both blessed and cursed. This became our new normal. It wasn't every night, but it was frequent enough to become a pattern, a ritual. 2 or 3 times a week, after a particularly grueling day, my buzzer would ring. He would appear at my door, looking like a soldier returning from a war, and I would let him in. The pretense of watching a movie remained, but we both knew it was just an excuse. It was a framework for a different kind of communion. The initial, hesitant request to lean his head on my shoulder soon became an unspoken assumption. He would sink onto the couch, and within minutes, he would be leaning against me, seeking my warmth and stillness like a plant seeks the sun. I became a connoisseur of the subtle language of his exhaustion. I could tell by the way he slumped onto the couch how bad his day had been. I could read the level of his stress and the tension of the muscles in his neck and shoulders as he rested against me. My apartment became his decompression chamber, the airlock between the crushing pressure of his professional life and the vacuum of his empty apartment. And I, his quiet, observant friend, became the keeper of that space. My own feelings were a roaring fire that I had to constantly bank, turning it down to a gentle, warming hearth so as not to scare him away. Every night he was there, I was walking a tightrope of emotion. The joy of his proximity was so intense it was painful, a sharp, sweet ache in the center of my chest. But it was always tempered by the bitter knowledge of its context. I was his friend, his safe harbor, his brother. To him, this was comfort. To me, it was a beautiful, exquisite torture. The ritual began to escalate in small, almost imperceptible increments. One evening, he was particularly agitated, his mind still racing from a conference call that had gone late. He couldn't settle. He shifted against me, restless and tense. Then, without a word, he uncurled his long legs from the floor and swung them up onto the couch, stretching out and resting his head in my lap. He did it so naturally, with such an air of unthinking entitlement, that I was too stunned to react. He curled onto his side, facing the back of the couch, and threw an arm across my legs, as if to anchor himself. My lap. He was using my lap as a pillow. I looked down at the top of his head, at the familiar whirls of his dark hair, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I could feel the warmth of his cheek through the denim of my jeans. I wanted, more than anything, to reach down and run my fingers through his hair, to soothe the last of the tension from him. But I didn't. I couldn't. That would be crossing a line. That would be taking what he was offering as friendship and twisting it into something else. So I kept my hands resting on my own knees, my fingers clenched into tight fists, and I let him sleep. I began to live for those evenings. My own life, my own work, started to feel like the empty space between his visits. I would find myself checking my phone, waiting for the text that said he was having a bad day. A part of me, a dark, selfish part, started to wish for his days to be difficult, for his projects to be stressful, so that he would need me. The realization made me feel sick with shame. I was feeding my own emotional starvation on his unhappiness. But the need for his presence was a powerful, addictive thing. His scent, a mixture of his ridiculously expensive shampoo and the clean, ozone smell of his skin, would linger on my couch cushions for a day after he left, a ghostly reminder of his presence. I would sometimes sit there, after he was gone, and press my face into the spot where his head had been, inhaling the faint trace of him, a pathetic act of a man deeply, hopelessly in love. The boundary between my body and his began to feel increasingly porous. He seemed to have forgotten where he ended and I began. He would fall asleep with his hand resting on my stomach or his leg thrown over mine. He started to talk in his sleep, murmuring about spreadsheets and deadlines, his voice muffled against my side. I learned the rhythm of his sleeping breaths, the way he would twitch just before falling into a deep sleep. I knew his body almost as well as I knew my own. It was an intimacy born of exhaustion and plausible deniability, a physical closeness that existed in a strange, unacknowledged bubble outside the normal rules of our friendship. In the light of day, when we would meet for coffee on a weekend, we would revert to our old dynamic. We would sit across from each other, maintaining a normal, friendly distance. We never spoke of the nights on my couch. It was a secret we kept together, without ever admitting it was a secret. It was our own private language, spoken only in the dark, in the language of touch and proximity. I became an expert at interpreting the silence. I learned that the way he rested his head against me was a form of communication. A heavy, immediate slump was a sign of utter defeat. A slower, more tentative lean meant he was still wrestling with the day's events, his mind not yet ready to surrender. Sometimes he wouldn't sleep at all. He would just lie there, his head in my lap, his eyes open and staring at the flickering screen, and I would feel the subtle vibrations of his thoughts, the tension coiling and uncoiling within him. On those nights, I would sometimes risk it. I would gently, so gently, rest my hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of support. He would never acknowledge it with words, but I would feel a subtle shift in him, a slight release of tension, a quiet acceptance of the gesture. It was a conversation happening on a purely physical level, a dialogue of nerve endings and body heat. One particular night, the weather had turned cold, a sudden, sharp plunge into late autumn. He arrived shivering, the chill of the evening having seeped into his bones. He had a blanket on my couch, an old, soft-wool thing I'd had for years. As we settled into our usual positions, him stretched out with his head on a pillow next to my thigh this time, he shivered again. Without thinking, I pulled the blanket from the back of the couch and draped it over him. He murmured a thank you, his voice thick with sleepiness. A few minutes later, he shifted, and in his sleep-addled state, he pulled the blanket further up, tucking it around both of us, creating a shared cocoon of warmth. He shuffled closer, pressing his back against my side, and draped an arm over my waist, pulling me into the orbit of his warmth. We were, for all intents and purposes, cuddling. There was no other word for it. We were lying on my couch, under a single blanket, his arm around me, his body pressed against mine. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The line, the one I had been so careful to maintain, had been crossed, and he was the one who had done it, all while maintaining the perfect alibi of being half asleep. The world outside my apartment ceased to exist during these hours. It was just the two of us, in the low light, with the murmur of the television as our soundtrack. I studied the lines of his face and the flickering glow, the sweep of his eyelashes against his cheek, the slight curve of his lips. I memorized the map of him, the cartography of his sleeping form. I was a watchman, a guardian of his rest. I was also a thief, stealing these moments of intimacy that were not truly meant for me, not in the way I wanted them. The conflict was tearing me apart. The happiness was so intense, so pure, that it felt dangerous. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this couldn't last. This fragile, beautiful, ambiguous thing we had built would eventually have to be named. And I was terrified that when it was, it would shatter into a million pieces. The breaking point, the moment the unspoken became spoken, arrived on a Thursday night. It had been a particularly brutal week for him. The project was nearing its final deadline, and the pressure was immense. He had been at my apartment every night that week, each visit leaving him looking more depleted than the last. That night, he arrived looking utterly broken. There were dark circles under his eyes, and a tremor in his hand as he accepted the mug of tea I offered him. He didn't even make it to the couch. He just sank onto the floor, leaning his back against the sofa, and buried his face in his hands. "I can't do this anymore, Leo," he said, his voice muffled by his palms. "I'm going to fail. I'm going to let everyone down." I sat on the floor next to him, my shoulder brushing against his. I didn't offer platitudes or false encouragement. I just sat with him in his despair. After a long silence, he dropped his hands and looked at me, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He looked so young, so vulnerable. The polished armor of the successful consultant was gone, and all that was left was my friend, hurting and lost. "Just for tonight," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Can we just forget everything else exists?" I nodded. "Everything else is gone." We moved to the couch, and he didn't just lean on me. He collapsed into me. He curled up against my chest, his head tucked under my chin, and wrapped his arms around my waist, holding on like a drowning man. I wrapped my own arms around him, pulling him closer. The pretense was gone. This wasn't about comfort after a long day. This was about seeking refuge from a storm that was raging inside him. I held him, my hand stroking his back in slow, soothing circles. We stayed like that for a long time, not speaking, the only sound the soft whisper of our breathing and the frantic, unsynchronized beating of our own hearts. The movie we had put on ended, and the television went to a blank, black screen, plunging the room into near darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the city through my window. He was so still in my arms I thought he had fallen asleep. I rested my cheek against the top of his head, breathing in his scent, allowing myself, just for a moment, to pretend that this was real, that this was ours. Then, he spoke, his voice a low rumble against my chest. "Leo." "Yeah," I whispered back, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. He shifted slightly, tilting his head back to look up at me. His face was only inches from mine. In the dim light, his eyes were dark pools of something I couldn't quite decipher. Fear, need, confusion. It was all there. His gaze was so intense, so searching, that I felt completely undone by it. It felt like he was finally, truly seeing me. Not just as a friend, not just as a safe harbor, but as something else. "Would it be okay?" he began, his voice barely a breath. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The city noise outside faded to nothing. The air in my lungs turned to stone. The question hung between us, fragile and terrifying and beautiful. It was the sound of a door I had thought was sealed forever, creaking open. It was the question I had dreamed of for 7 years and never, in a million lifetimes, expected to hear. My carefully constructed walls, the fortress of self-protection I had built around my heart, crumbled to dust in an instant. All the analysis, all the fear, all the second-guessing, it all evaporated. There was only his question and the simple, terrifying, overwhelming truth. I couldn't speak. I could only nod, a small, jerky movement. It was all the answer he needed. He rose up slowly, his movements tentative, as if he were approaching a frightened animal. He cupped my face with his hands, his palms warm against my skin, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones. He searched my eyes one last time, a final, silent question. And then, he leaned in and pressed his lips to mine. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss like in the movies. It was soft. It was hesitant. It was a question, a confession, and an apology all at once. It was the taste of salt from his unshed tears and the faint, sweet flavor of the tea I had made him. It was a kiss that spoke of years of unspoken affection, of a need so deep it had no name, of a friendship so profound it had finally, inevitably, buckled under the weight of something more. It was the quietest, most earth-shattering moment of my life. The crossing of a threshold. We had stepped out of the hallway and into the room, and I had no idea if the house was about to collapse around us. The aftermath of the kiss was a profound, terrifying silence. We pulled apart, but he didn't move away. He rested his forehead against mine, our breath mingling in the small space between us. I could feel the tremor in his hands, still holding my face. The silence was not empty. It was dense, packed with everything that had just happened and everything that might happen next. It was the silence of a held breath, of a world waiting to see if it would spin forward or shatter. In that moment, I felt a terrifying clarity. The ambiguity that had been both my comfort and my torment was gone. We had named the thing between us, not with words, but with an action that could not be undone. The ritual was broken. The plausible deniability was vaporized. And I was more afraid than I had ever been in my life. He was the first to pull back, and the movement felt like a physical tearing. He slid away from me on the couch, creating a chasm of several inches that felt like a mile. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at his own hands, which were clasped tightly in his lap. The air grew cold. The warmth we had shared under the blanket felt like a distant memory from another lifetime. I watched him, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I could see the panic starting to bloom on his face, the slow dawn of horror and confusion. He had acted on an impulse, a moment of profound emotional vulnerability, and now, in the quiet aftermath, the full weight of his actions was crashing down on him. I'm sorry, he finally whispered, the words sounding rusted and foreign. I shouldn't have done that. I don't know what. I was just tired and stressed. I'm so sorry, Leo. Each word was a new fracture in my heart. He was trying to put it back in the box. He was trying to unring the bell, to retreat back into the safety of the hallway and pretend he had never turned the knob. He was attributing the most significant moment of my life to stress and fatigue. It was a slap in the face, a brutal dismissal of the sincerity I had felt in his touch. The hope that had flared so brightly just moments before was extinguished, leaving behind the bitter smell of smoke and ash. Don't, I said, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. Don't you dare chalk that up to being tired. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were wide with a kind of panicked desperation. He looked like a trapped animal. But it was, he insisted, his voice rising slightly. I'm not. I don't. This isn't me. You're my best friend. He said the words best friend like a shield, a ward against the very thing he had just done. He stood up abruptly, pacing the small space of my living room. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew meant he was spiraling. I need to go, he said, not looking at me. He grabbed his jacket, the one he had discarded hours ago, and shoved his arms into it with clumsy, jerky movements. He was fleeing the room, fleeing the moment, fleeing whatever it was he had felt that made him kiss me. He was at the door before I could even process the whiplash of it all. From the most profound intimacy to this frantic, panicked retreat in the space of 5 minutes. Alex, I said, my voice pleading. I stood up, taking a step toward him. Wait. We need to talk about this. There's nothing to talk about, he said, his hand on the doorknob, his back still to me. It was a mistake. Let's just forget it happened. Please. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent apartment. I stood there, in the middle of my living room, my lips still tingling from the ghost of his kiss. The blanket we had shared was pooled on the floor. The indentation of his body was still on the couch next to mine. The entire room was a crime scene, a monument to a beautiful thing that had been murdered just as it was being born. I sank back onto the couch, the grief and confusion so overwhelming it felt like a physical illness. He had opened the door, and then he had slammed it shut in my face, leaving me alone in a room I had never wanted to be in by myself. The next few days were a special kind of hell. A silent, agonizing limbo. He didn't call. He didn't text. My messages to him, casual at first, "Hey, you okay?" And then more direct, "Alex, we really need to talk," went unanswered. They sat there in my message history, two blue check marks of silent, brutal rejection. The silence from him was a deafening roar. It consumed everything. The ritual was not just broken, it was obliterated. My evenings were once again my own, quiet and empty and unbearably lonely. The couch felt enormous, a vast, empty landscape. I kept expecting the buzzer to ring, but it never did. He had retreated completely, not just from the new, fragile intimacy we had shared, but from our friendship itself. He had taken it all with him when he fled my apartment. I oscillated between anger and a deep, hollowing sadness. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for his refusal to even have a conversation about what had happened. I was angry that he had initiated something so profound only to treat it like a shameful mistake. But underneath the anger was a cavern of hurt. The fear that I had been nothing more than a convenient emotional utility, a human heating pad to be used and discarded. The terror that his kiss had meant nothing, that it was just an aberration, a momentary lapse in his otherwise perfectly straight, perfectly ordered life. And worse, the fear that in breaking our unspoken rules, we had shattered the very foundation of our 7-year friendship. I had lost him, in every way a person could be lost. After a week of this agonizing silence, I knew I couldn't let it go. I couldn't let our friendship die this way, with a whimper of unspoken fear and confusion. It deserved more than that. I deserved more than that. If it was truly over, I needed to hear it from him. I needed to look him in the eye and understand why. I couldn't live in the wreckage of his panicked flight. So, I did something I had never done before. I went to him. I stood outside his apartment building, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. It was a sleek, modern building, all glass and steel, a world away from my cozy, lived-in brick walk-up. It felt like his territory, a place where he held the advantage. Taking a deep breath, I went inside and took the elevator to his floor. Standing outside his door, I almost lost my nerve. But then I thought of the way he had looked at me just before he kissed me, the raw vulnerability in his eyes. That was real. I had to believe that was real. I knocked on the door, my knuckles rapping a sharp, definitive sound. It took a long time for him to answer. I could hear movement inside, a hesitation. Finally, the locks turned, and the door opened a few inches. He peered out, and when he saw me, his face closed off. He looked exhausted, even worse than he had the week before. It was clear he hadn't been sleeping. "Leo," he said, his voice flat. "What are you doing here?" He made no move to open the door wider. "You won't answer my calls," I said, my own voice steadier than I expected. "You can't just disappear, Alex. You don't get to do that. Not to me." He flinched at my words. He looked down, then back up at me, his eyes filled with a miserable conflict. "I don't know what to say. Then let me in and we can figure it out together," I said, pushing down the surge of frustration. "Hiding from it isn't going to make it go away. It's been a week. You owe me a conversation." He stared at me for a long moment, his internal battle playing out across his features. Finally, with a sigh of weary resignation, he stepped back and opened the door. I walked into his apartment. It was immaculate, stylish, and completely impersonal. It looked like a page from a furniture catalog. There was none of the lived-in warmth of my place. It was a space designed for a life, but it felt like no one actually lived there. It was the architectural equivalent of the man he was pretending to be. He closed the door and leaned against it, as if to block his only escape route. He crossed his arms over his chest, a defensive posture. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I was the one who had forced this confrontation, so I knew I had to be the one to speak first. "Why did you kiss me, Alex?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. I needed to start there. At the source. He shook his head, looking away. I told you. I was stressed. I wasn't thinking clearly. It was a mistake. Look at me, I said, my voice hardening. Look at me and tell me it was a mistake. He slowly, reluctantly, met my gaze. And in his eyes, I saw not a mistake, but a profound and terrifying truth he was trying to deny. It was more than that, and you know it. I continued, taking a step closer. This us, on the couch, that has been happening for months. This wasn't just one night. It was 100 small moments leading up to one big one. You can't pretend it came out of nowhere. You can't pretend you haven't been feeling something. He finally broke. A strangled sob escaped his throat, and he covered his face with his hands. I don't know what I'm feeling, he choked out, his voice thick with tears. I'm so confused, Leo. My whole life, I've had a plan. A blueprint. College, job, get married, have kids. You know? It's all laid out. And you're not in the blueprint. Not like this. He sank down, sliding down the door until he was sitting on the floor, a mirror of how he had been in my apartment a week ago. I went to him, kneeling in front of him. This was it. This was the honest confession I had been waiting for. I'm scared, he whispered, looking up at me, his face streaked with tears. Kissing you, it felt right. It felt more right than anything has felt in a very long time. And that terrifies me. Because what does that mean? What does that make me? Everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted, it's all coming apart. And I don't know what to do. The anger I had been holding on to dissolved, replaced by a wave of profound empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting the monumental, terrifying shift within himself. He wasn't running from me. He was running from a truth he wasn't ready to face. His world, with its neat lines and clear destinations, had been thrown into chaos, and the epicenter of that earthquake was me. Hey, I said softly, reaching out and placing my hand on his knee. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. Look at me. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. You don't have to label it. You don't have to change your entire life's blueprint overnight. All you have to do is stop running. I looked at him, my own heart bare and exposed. I love you, Alex, I said, the words I had held back for 7 years finally breaking free. I have been in love with you for a very long time. And what happened between us, it wasn't a mistake to me. It was everything. But I can't be the only one who isn't scared. I can't build this by myself. He stared at me, my confession hanging in the air between us. He searched my face, and I let him see it all. The years of quiet yearning, the fear, the hope, the unwavering depth of my affection for him. He took a shaky breath. I don't know what I am, he said, his voice raw. But I know I don't want to lose you. The thought of not having you in my life this past week, it's been the worst week of my life. Worse than any failed project. Worse than any breakup. It was just empty. He reached out, his hand covering mine on his knee. His touch was hesitant, but it was there. It was a connection. I'm sorry I ran, he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. I was a coward. You were the one thing that felt safe, and I made you feel unsafe. Can we just start there? With me being sorry, and you being you. It wasn't a grand declaration of love. It wasn't a promise of a perfect future. It was small and broken and honest. It was a beginning. It was him, finally, taking a single, tentative step back into the room he had fled. It was enough. I squeezed his hand. Yeah, I said, a small smile touching my lips for the first time in a week. We can start there. We didn't go back to how things were. We couldn't. The old architecture of our friendship, with its unspoken rules and carefully maintained distances, had been demolished. We had to build something new from the rubble. The process was slow and careful, and marked by a new kind of intentionality. The ambiguity was gone, replaced by a fragile, terrifying honesty. We started talking, really talking, not just about work or movies, but about us, about what we were to each other. Alex spoke of his fear and confusion, the dizzying feeling of his own identity shifting under his feet. I spoke of my years of hidden feelings, of the joy and pain of our strange ritual on the couch. He still came to my apartment after long days at work. But it was different now. There was no pretense. He would walk in, and I would open my arms, and he would walk into them. He would hold me, his face buried in my neck, and I would feel the tension of his day meld away not into a platonic comfort, but into the arms of someone he was choosing to be with. The couch was still our place, but it was no longer a place of one-sided yearning. We would lie there, tangled up together under the same old wool blanket, and it was a shared act. His hand in mine wasn't an accident of sleep, it was a choice. His head on my chest wasn't a sign of exhaustion. It was a gesture of trust and affection. There were more kisses. They were still gentle, still questioning, but they were no longer followed by panic and retreat. They were explorations, a new language we were learning together. We were mapping out the boundaries of this new country we found ourselves in. Sometimes, I would see a flicker of the old fear in his eyes, the shadow of the blueprint he was letting go of. But he didn't run. He would take a deep breath, look at me, and seem to find his footing again. He was choosing this. He was choosing me, over and over again, in 100 small ways every day. One Saturday morning, about a month after our confrontation, I woke up in my own bed to the smell of coffee. I opened my eyes, and Alex was standing in the doorway of my bedroom, holding 2 mugs. He had stayed the night, falling asleep in my arms on the couch, and I had woken him up in the middle of the night to lead him to my bed, an invitation he had accepted with a sleepy, trusting smile. It was the first time he had ever been in my bedroom. He walked over and handed me a mug, his fingers brushing against mine. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching me with a soft expression. The morning light streamed in through the window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. The room was filled with a sense of profound, quiet peace. "I deleted my dating apps last night," he said, his voice calm and certain. I looked at him over the rim of my mug. "Oh yeah, he said, taking a sip of his own coffee. It felt dishonest. To be looking for something out there, when the only thing I really want is right here. He looked around my room, then his eyes settled back on me. "This feels like home, Leo. You feel like home. I think maybe you always have, and I was just too stubborn and scared to see it." The admission was simple, delivered without drama, in the quiet light of a new day. And it was everything. It was the final brick being laid in our new foundation. He wasn't confused anymore. He wasn't afraid. He was just here, with me. He had finally walked all the way through the door and closed it gently behind him, sealing us in together. The journey wasn't about him discovering he was gay, or me turning him. It was a much simpler, more human story. It was about a man who had built his life on a rigid set of expectations, discovering that the home his heart had been searching for was in a place he had never thought to look. It was about love being a force more powerful than any blueprint. He was not a different person. He was just finally becoming the person he was always meant to be. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The quiet that had once been filled with my unspoken yearning was now filled with a shared, peaceful certainty. We learned that a home isn't 4 walls and a roof. It's a feeling of safety. It's the quiet knowledge that there is one person in the world with whom you don't have to pretend. It's the space where you can finally, completely, let go. He had come to me that first night saying he didn't want to be alone, and in the end, we had discovered that neither of us ever had to be alone again. We had found our way out of the long, lonely hallway and into a room filled with light, a room we had built together.